This lesson is focusing on the development of civilization. It's being brought to you by Apple Hands Productions. On the screen, you'll see the standard definition of what they mean by the term civilization. So really what they're saying is we're talking about the development of certain characteristics which help develop this society beyond the previous Neolithic society. Here you see where civilizations began to develop across the world, all relatively at the same time, relative as far as Earth's history concerned, that being, of course, within a few hundred years or thousands of years of each other. We're going to focus here, if you look in the red circle, this area of Southwest Asia. This area is one of the first areas to start seeing civilization really begin to develop. This region is known as the Fertile Crescent. Here you can see it in green, appropriately named because it's, well, fertile, and it's pretty much in a crescent shape if you think about it. Again, this is because of the rivers in the area that made it so. One area in particular, the Fertile Crescent, that we're going to focus on is here in kind of the reddish orange. This area is known as Mesopotamia. It translates out, that's actually a Greek term, it translates out to mean land between two rivers. Pretty appropriate because there's the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and this is where this first civilization is going to happen. And the key to why it happened here is because of this, and that's surplus food, or surplus grain in this case. Again, people settled this region because it was so fertile, and the typical thing that they grew were grain crops. Here's wheat, because wheat has a long storage life. That doesn't mean they didn't grow other types of things such as fruits and vegetables. Those just become more difficult to store long term. And so wheat was the key. Wheat was productive. Wheat produced more than what a farmer could consume. And with that surplus, it freed him up to be able to go pursue other products. Perhaps he finds out that his neighbor is really good at making certain tools to help harvest the wheat. And he wants his neighbor to make him one. And in return, he gives him some of his wheat. In fact, other neighbors begin going to this individual to have tools made. And this man goes from a wheat grower, what his original job was, is to becoming the local tool maker. And he's able to do that because there's extra food in the community that he can trade to his tools for to get the food he needs to survive upon. The same thing happens with another person. Maybe they live by the river. These rivers were heavy in clay, and this particular person has learned how to use this clay and make storage vessels, which we would later call pottery. Again, very important because it keeps the wheat dry. It keeps out varmints from the wheat. And so they begin trading maybe some of my wheat to these potters to get the clay pots that I need. In fact, this person once was a farmer, but now they're a full-time pottery maker. And they're able to do that because they're surplus foods. So one of the keys for civilization is being able to produce extra food so that people in your society can pursue other jobs. If you notice on this map, there's some black little dots over here in the Mesopotamian region. These start becoming known as city-states. And the name really kind of defines it. These are individual cities who are their own little countries, if you will. So while the people in Mesopotamia had really fairly similar culture, they identified with their city, not as a united people. They created their own laws, their own customs. Again, somewhat similar, but they identified with their cities themselves. Sometimes the competition between these cities over land, water resources, minerals, often brought them into conflict. And that's where you start seeing the development of leadership programs. These cities became, well, cultural centers. They became trading centers, and they became the political hubs of the city itself, of the surrounding areas itself. So while most people are still farmers, these cities pop up and become the central places where farmers bring their goods, or where leadership's going to begin. Many of the early leaders, which we later would call kings, were created as a way to help protect the neighboring lands. And in return for this protection, farmers or people at the market would have to contribute to the king a form of taxes, which he would use to equip the city, and eventually you would think of as soldiers to help protect the people. Here's some of the long-distance trade routes that began to develop. So it wasn't always just local trade. They're also developing long-distance trade for goods that people may have wanted. Often these were luxury goods. Most of these cities had one of these inside. It's pronounced a ziggurat. It's a temple. So each city had a ziggurat where the gods or goddesses could be worshipped. Most of these gods and goddesses were attributed to things in nature, things that the average person couldn't explain themselves. The average person doesn't know about, water vapor in the atmosphere, eventually bringing together the molecules and forming droplets which fall as rain. No, this is attributed to the rain gods. So the priests in these cities would make offerings on behalf of farmers, and the farmers would bring them part of their crop or goods that they produced to help support the local ziggurat, the priest, and be able to, of course, win over the gods in their favor. Unfortunately, as we became more civilized, we also see the increase of inequality within society. So unlike back in Paleolithic days, where most people were fairly equal, again the term is egalitarian, if anything, maybe women were even of a higher status, especially during Neolithic, as they were often the first farmers. As we begin to settle down within these civilizations, we see this begins to change. Women's roles are more defined by childbearing and child nurturing, and less as far as a contributor out to actually growing the crops, though that doesn't mean they didn't help. Men began taking over the role of food producers, and less as far as hunters. And within the city itself, cities and surrounding areas, we start seeing a new structure. At the top, of course, were kings and priests, because of what they're able to do. Kings, of course, creating eventually laws. We'll talk more about law codes coming up, but also providing structure and protection. Priests for their ability to communicate and win over the gods. Landowners were next in this social status. At least the best lands. So if you had the best lands, of course, you could rent them out and get income. 90% of people at this time are referred to as artisans. These are people that work with their hands. This would be your farmers, your tool makers, etc. The vast majority of people were in this area. And there was just a small amount of this that was beginning to happen. That would be slavery. It wasn't really pronounced at this time. It typically was for debt. So if you had incurred a debt and were unable to pay, you have to go work for somebody to pay off that debt. But even at this early junction in human history, unfortunately, we're starting to see slavery begin to develop. We also see this characteristic, which is really important, and that is the concept of writing. Early Sumerian writing in this area used pictographs, as you can see popping up on the screen. So they used pictures to convey meaning. Of course, the problem is the meanings. The top left picture looks like a boot or a shoe, but the meaning actually was walk. The top middle picture, it looks like, well, you determine what you think it looks like. This was actually the symbol for trade. So wheat is the stalks, the road there, you're out to trade. Bottom left, oftentimes students say it's a flag. It actually means to plow fields. So the problem is with pictographs is you have to understand the pictures and you have to be able to draw them consistently. That's why eventually we see the development of what's called cuneiform writing. And by using clay tablets, no paper at this point, but they had plenty of clay from the rivers, and using a stylus, which was really more like a pencil that had been carved into a triangular shape, they would make impressions in the clay to form words. So here's examples of cuneiform. So again, it talks about the positioning, where the positioning of the characters are and the combination of characters. It was consistent. Now again, you still had to know the characters, and that was one of the drawbacks of early cuneiform writing, is that there were over 6,000 symbols. So while Mesopotamian people had writing, very few people could really actually do it and understand it. That's where you see the position known as a scribe. Scribes had the ability to read and write. And so as a common person, you'd have to go to the local scribe if you had to have something written or something read. In return, you'd have to pay them with probably a portion of your crop or goods that you make. Probably the biggest thing that really helps to denote civilizations from other is their developments of technology. An example of that would be this, the wheel. taking something simple, developing it into something as you see the transition to help make life easier. And that's really what technology is coming up with devices or concepts to make life for humans easier than what it currently is. Irrigation systems. So most of these people are farmers, and while if you live near the river, that's great because you have access to water. If you don't live near the river, how do you get the water that you need? So here's an example of a counterbalance. So take a large rock and put it on one end of a wooden pole. Then you pull down the string, or I should call it really a rope, into the water source, and then the weight of the rock helps raise it up, and then you pivot it over to dump in your fields. Here's kind of a same concept. This was actually in Egypt, where they're moving water from the river in stages up to the fields. And of course, in that field, that water could flow to the fields where it was needed. Some way to plow up the land. So wooden plows were developed as opposed to the early digging sticks. And even the development of metallurgy. This is often sometimes referred to as the Bronze Age. They learned how to take copper and tin and combine it in proper amounts to make a material known as bronze. Bronze, though not the most durable of all metals, certainly was better than wood or bone, and even stone. It had the ability to be resharpened, unlike those other methods. And even the development of mathematics. So again, using that same stylus, but developing it into a combination. This was all really base 10. So if you look at the far left-hand column, you look at the position of what the symbol was for 1. You do that in combinations up to 9, and then you use the symbol as number 10. That repeats itself as you look at the next column. And then when you get to 20, you use 2 of those same kind of triangle-y looking things, and so on and so forth. So all of these concepts helped develop this region, which helped, of course, develop the first civilizations.